Hi, my name's Andrew and this is Mickey Man's RCT Station. In this video we'll go through 6 myths or misconceptions that I've noticed quite a lot when I'm poking around the various RollerCoaster Tycoon communities on the web. This has included stuff I've seen on the RCT Reddit page, the 2 RCT Facebook communities, other RCT gameplay videos on YouTube, but also stuff that I've previously been mistaken on. These misconceptions, which are in no particular order of significance, aren't aimed to be critical or anything, but more as a fun way of drawing attention to some of the more obscure gameplay mechanics. These also strictly apply to the 2D isometric versions of the game, the original RCT and its expansions, RCT2 and its expansions, RCT Classic, and OpenRCT2. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. Myth number 1. Nauseous guests can use bathrooms and/or litter bins. Possibly the most common misconception that I see, especially with newer players, is the idea that guests can use the toilet or bathroom buildings to heave up their lunch from Burger Bar 1. Whilst this is probably along the lines of what you'd expect in reality, it just doesn't happen in the game. The toilets in RCT are strictly for guests to relieve their bathroom status bar when it gets too high. The only way guests can meaningfully reduce their nausea levels in the game are sitting down on a bench, using a first aid room, or make a mess of your path. Nausea level also drops off over time walking around, but this seems to be quite slowly, and it comes with the risk of them dirtying your paths. Litter bins, on the other hand, are purely for guests to drop off any trash after they're finished with their food or drink. Myth number 2. Increasing a ride's excitement rating means guests are more likely to ride it. This might seem somewhat counterintuitive, but the excitement rating of a ride actually has no bearing on whether a guest chooses to go on it. A guest's choice of ride is mostly dependent on its intensity rating, whereas the excitement rating is, for most rides, the biggest factor in determining its maximum ticket price, so it's more an indicator of profit potential in parks where you can charge for the rides. When a guest is thinking that they want to go on something more thrilling, it means they're wanting a ride with a higher intensity rating. A guest's preferred ride intensity is a specified range of values indicating the type of ride they're most likely to choose. Some examples of ride intensity ranges are between 3 and 6, less than 3, and more than 4. The most common range by far in the majority of scenarios in RCT is more than 4. This indicates a preference generally towards higher intensity thrill rides and roller coasters. Notice though that it is only a preferred ride intensity range. A very happy guest is actually willing to ride something up to 2.3 intensity points outside their listed preferred range. The most popular rides in the game tend to be the ones with intensity ratings around the 3 to 5 mark, as it tends to fall into that sweet spot in the mix of guests' preferred intensity ranges. To help illustrate all this, here's an example of a guest choosing between the space rings and a ghost train with much higher excitement rating. It's the extra intensity of the space rings that makes it a more attractive ride to the guest. Some rides that are often affected by this high excitement to low intensity ratio include river rapids, car rides, ghost trains, and observation towers. The nausea rating of rides also comes into play with guests choosing it. If a ride's nausea rating is high to very high, a guest with nil to low nausea tolerance is likely to turn it down, even if the ride's intensity rating is within their preferred intensity range. Myth number 3. Hiring a few security guards will prevent all vandalism from occurring in your park. Okay, so this might be possible in a really small park, or one with a huge amount of security guards with small patrol areas, but you'll most likely still get vandalized objects in your park from time to time even with security. Security guards only prevent vandalism occurring within a certain distance of their presence, which, from an experiment I did in OpenRCT2, appears to be a 13 by 13 tile area centered about the security guard's location at a given time. Based on some feedback on my recent Reddit post, this isn't entirely true. It should be closer to a 14 by 14 tile area based on the code, which Marcel explained in his Vandals in RCT2 video. The code says the distance of influence is the equivalent of 7 tiles distance in both the X and Y direction, forming a square. With this example, the guard is in pretty much the center of the central tile, so 7 tiles distance away includes 6 full tiles and then roughly 2 half tile widths. I think what's happening in my original experiment is when the guard moves to the extreme ends of that central tile, it loses that behavioral influence for that 7th tile in the opposite direction for a split second, giving Vandals time to do their thing, eventually resulting in all objects on that 7th tile away from the center being vandalized. Using the console in OpenRCT2 to freeze the location of the guard at each edge, rather than letting them roam about on the single tile, you can see that the guard's influence does in fact seem to be more like 7 tiles away. All that being said, I think the 13 by 13 tile area is a good conservative number to go with. Anyway, I'm sorry about diving down a bit of a rabbit hole, but thought it would be worth exploring. Anyway, back to it. If you're adamant about stopping all vandalism, you'll have to hire a pretty absurd amount of security guards and probably spend a considerable amount of time zoning to make sure you've got good coverage at all times, particularly if it's a park of medium to large size. This might be worth it if you're in a scenario with no money limitations, but if not, you're better off spending money on improving the park either with more rides or handymen to ensure the paths are clean, which helps prevent guests from turning into those raging red-faced vandals in the first place. Even if you get the odd vandalized object, replacing them isn't that expensive anyway. Myth number 4. Park value is related to the building cost of rides. Park value, and as a result company value, doesn't necessarily align with the actual cost of construction of rides and attractions. In fact, these are usually vastly different quantities. Park value, while it sounds straightforward, has a lot going on in how it's calculated, becomes mostly down to the ratings or stats of your rides, with the general rule being higher stats giving a larger park value contribution. Here's an example of two corkscrew coasters which each have a pretty similar park value contribution on their own, but the one on the right is more than twice the cost of the one on the left. The similar park value contribution is down to the stats being comparable. Occasionally, the cost of a ride can be reasonably close to its eventual park value contribution. Flat rides tend to have the closest correlation between the two. In most cases, however, particularly with roller coasters, there can be a pretty huge disparity between the ride's park value contribution and the actual cost of its construction. This disparity between cost and a ride's park value contribution is less in Open RCT2 than vanilla RCT2 and RCT Classic due to some tweaks in the code. This is particularly noticeable with flat rides. Something interesting to note is that park value contributions in the original RollerCoaster Tycoon seem to follow the same general formula as RCT2 and RCT Classic, but appear to be divided by a factor of 10. This explains why park value numbers are so much smaller in RCT1. Marcel has a great video explaining in detail the many variables that come into the park value calculation. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. Myth number 5. Brake runs, external to the station brakes, will stop your coaster trains from crashing due to a brakes failure. RCT's disaster mode, the dreaded brakes failure. If you've played the game for long enough, you've probably witnessed the horror of your coaster trains exploding due to this at some point. I, and I'm pretty sure quite a few others, always thought that brake runs placed outside of the station brakes were immune to these brakes failures. Turns out this isn't the case. When the brakes failure breakdown occurs, all brakes on that coaster become useless until you hear the sound from the mechanic. I think the main culprit behind this confusion is the fact that this type of breakdown was labelled as a station brakes failure in the original RCT, implying that only the station brakes were affected. This breakdown definition was revised to the more accurate brakes failure when RCT2 first came out, which has been subsequently used in RCT Classic and Open RCT2. RCT2 introduced the ability to use block brakes and block sections on many coaster types, which virtually eliminated the risk of your coaster trains crashing due to a brakes failure. These are also available in RCT Classic and of course Open RCT2. If you're using the original RCT or RCT Deluxe, or building a coaster type in RCT2 or RCT Classic that doesn't offer block brakes, the only way to guarantee you won't be affected by a brakes failure is to design your coaster in such a way that your train re-enters the station at less than about 31 miles per hour, or about 50 kilometers per hour, without the assistance of brakes anywhere on the track. Since guests add weight to the trains, I would suggest lowering this threshold to about 40 kilometers per hour during testing with an empty train. Making sure your lift hill isn't too large, ensuring your coaster is long enough, or using shorter length trains can all help with this. I guess you can also run your coaster with one train, but this will lose a lot of throughput, and potentially cash. And myth number 6. Park maps from info kiosks guarantee guests won't get lost. Something I notice a lot is people making the assumption that info kiosks that sell park maps prevent guests from getting lost. It seems apparent that guests do use park maps to help navigate themselves around the park, but I'm not really sure to what extent. The point remains though that guests with park maps can still get lost or stuck in a park with dead ends and a generally poor path layout. Even with a good path layout, large parks may still result in guests getting stuck, but this is more due to limitations in the pathfinding algorithm of the game. And there were 6 myths or misconceptions that I see fairly frequently in the RollerCoaster Tycoon community. Have you come across any myths or misconceptions while you've been playing? If so, feel free to share them in the comments below. I'm sure I missed a few and would love to see some others. As always, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!